Hi, church. I'm trying to get this to work today, so I hope this does this time. It is fall, and that means that we see leaf peepers out, or maybe we are leaf peeping to the oranges and the reds and the yellows. And when I wrote that, I didn't know that there would be snow in Littleton as well. So we have this season of fall upon us, this season of centering ourselves on renewal and change. And the time kind of set this mood for me when I was reading Mark 9 this week. It added that festive kind of feeling to the gospel. And one thing about it is reflecting on holidays, reflecting on those special days that are coming up to us in fall. So we have Halloween quickly upon us, and we also have Thanksgiving in the near future. And they're both going to be here soon. And during this year of 2020, when there's been a lot of loss, it seems like it's really special and important to center ourselves on these kind of days of celebration, these holy days that we call holidays. All Saints' Day, the basis for Halloween, is a time when we celebrate our ancestors and those who have come before us. Thanksgiving is a time when we celebrate family and the idea of commitment through love. So I want to think about Thanksgiving actually a little bit, because for me and for many of us, it's that time of squash and stuffing and green bean casserole and, of course, turkey and then whatever else you love eating on your table. But I have many memories of my mom teaching me how to hold a turkey and how to wash it out in the sink. Now, I remember that we've always put a lot of salt in the cavity, and I know there's some mixed opinions about if you should put salt or not in your turkey, but we would salt all around the bird and salt inside the bird, and I used to find this kind of funny. But salt is actually a key ingredient in cooking. It purifies the poultry. I found it less strange when I started learning about salt, because I realized that in some parts of the world, it's not just salt rubbing limited to turkeys. They use other things as well. You see, in the Middle East, salt rubbing includes newborns. Newborn babies are rubbed with salt as a reference to Ezekiel 16:4. Which denounces someone as faulted by saying, "As for your nativity, on the day you were born, your navel cord was not cut, nor were you washed in water to cleanse you. You were not rubbed with salt, nor wrapped in swaddling cloths." Babies are rubbed with salt to cleanse their spirit, so they will be raised with integrity and they will be seen as truthful. Think about that. Think about when you rub those salt around that turkey, that was also the idea of how they would rub a baby. It's so important still in parts of our world today that if there is no salt available, camel urine is used in placement of it. Not quite the tradition that many of us see in hospitals, but it does put salt into a different role in our mind, right? That there's a place of prominence, a power to salt. Now, in the U.S., we might have a different take on things. I remember about 10 years ago in New York City, they even launched what they called the National Salt Reduction Initiative, which called for food manufacturers to reduce the sodium in our foods with the goal of reducing it to about 25% off of items. Now, our contemporary separation from sodium makes it hard for us to reference that there are 40 times salt is talked about in the Bible. It's especially difficult for us to understand what's being said in our Mark reading today. Mark 9, verses 49 and 50. Everyone will be salted with fire. Salt is good, but if it loses its saltiness, how can you make it salty again? Have salt amongst yourselves and be at peace with each other. I've always found this to be a very intriguing line in our Bible. And yes, some of you might have heard me preach on this topic before, but it feels very pertinent for this time, so I wanted to come back to it, because there really is so much lying beneath this surface. So let's go deeper into the world of salt. To do that, though, we're going to need to transport ourselves to a different place and a different time, to really understand what salt meant when Jesus was living. We would have to kind of uncover a version of salt that is much more plentiful. You see, Jesus lived around the Dead Sea. Now, beautiful, glistening crystals that look like diamonds in the sun, but really they're just big pieces of salt that are along the edges, that are encased there, drying out. Now, there are literally hills and mountains made of salt in the area Jesus was born and worked. The most famous being Mount Sodom or Jebel Asdum, entirely made of rock salt. And there's these images of Lot's wife and stuff you can look on of other places where salt is just this, it's part of the agriculture, it's part of the geography around this region. Now, it began to be important, though, hundreds of thousands of years ago. That salt started laying its groundwork for our story today. Now, while the mountains of salt are there, there's this giant sea of salt that we can't really take out of the narrative of the Bible. It was something that was as prevalent to them as maple syrup is to New Englanders. Many gained their livelihood by gathering sea salt even in that day. Even today, they'll fill rock crevices with seawater and brine and allow the summer sun to dry them out, to evaporate the water. Then the sea crystals are collected. When we think about this, when we think about that, it is their job, it is their life, it is what they see every morning when they get up. Then we begin to see how salt factors into the subconsciousness of people. New Englanders think about it as snow, right? It's something that's so present to them. But we need to remember another piece, that at this time it was valued economically in a way that we don't consider today. The word that we have for salary is actually a Latin word based on the Roman word for salarium, referred to the money paid in a soldier's service, referencing this salt time period. This is typical to pay Roman workers in the form of salt, bread, wine, and olives. So when you get a salary now, think about that, if you've been paid in salt. I imagine it probably wouldn't make you too happy if you get one of those Morton salt containers in place of your check. But back then, it was quite the prize to have. The whole ancient Chinese economy, even, was based on salt and iron. The Celts are called Gauls because of the Greek word for salt. There was a salt road, just like there was, of what you've heard probably before, of the Silk Road. There were trade routes for salt. It was so important at that time. Now, if this interests you or it piques your interest, there's a whole book called Salt, A World History, and you can look that up online. But what we need to know is that salt was held to a higher standard than we do today. 2 Chronicles actually will give us something very important to think about when it comes to salt. Let me just get my page back here, friends. 2 Chronicles 13:5 tells us about the covenant of salt. Now, this I think is probably one of the least spoken about covenants in our Bible. We tend to put others much higher than this. We don't even know what is a salt covenant, Pastor Shannon, you're thinking. Well, let's first remember that God made covenants with the Israelites that were things of everyday nature. And I've just tried to establish that salt for them was an everyday thing. It was not unusual. Just like for Noah, it says, and the rainbow shall be in the cloud, and I will look upon it, and that I remember the everlasting covenant with God and every living creature of all that is upon the earth. So a rainbow was a kind of normal thing, but just rare enough, like it is for us today, that it had an important play, that it could be used to talk about covenant. The rainbow symbolized a promise for the people that the world would no longer be destroyed by the flood. Now for Abraham, his covenant was created in saying, look now towards the heavens and tell the stars, if thou be able to number them. And he said unto them, so shall thy seed be. In the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, unto thee thy seed I have given this land. The stars that he saw in the sky were the base of the covenant for Abraham and his future lineage, including us. Now, those are just a couple of the moments of covenant that we see in the Bible. But you see that they're natural things, right? And so Noah had a rainbow. Abram had stars, and David gets salt. 2 Chronicles 2:13-5 ask us all if we know about this. The literal words of that text say, "Don't you know that the Lord, the God of Israel, has given the kingship of Israel to David and his descendants forever by a covenant of salt"? How many of you did know that? Well, note in 2 Chronicles, it said a special word too. It said forever. Salt has preserving powers. It's what the Egyptians used to preserve the mummies. You can dissolve it in water, but still actually recover it after. You cannot lose salt, in a sense, right? We'll come back to how you can. But you can't really, if you have salt and it just gets wet, it's still salt. Salt becomes a symbol of prominence. It becomes a symbol of stability. It becomes a symbol of God's unchanging nature toward us, then and now. When we hear salt, we need to almost hear in the back of our ears this word eternity ringing for us. The salt shaker that sits on your table is traditionally a symbol of God. Something so ordinary. Just like bread and cup. God is all around us in the very ordinary nature of our lives. Salt is this eternally binding covenant between God and God's people through the line of David. And it's even more than that, because Leviticus 2:13 is going to say, "Season all your grain offerings with salt. Do not leave the salt of the covenant of your God out of your grain offering. Add salt to all of your offerings." Everything we give back to God is a symbol of our acceptance of that connection, that eternal commitment God has made. Guess you're going to have to start putting salt in your offerings when you come back, right? Maybe not. Salt in the offering plate isn't where we think of it, right? But it's a reminder to us that things do come back. Things that we felt were lost. And right now there is a lot that we feel is lost. People put their weddings on hold and their funerals on hold. People have lost jobs. People have lost hopes. But a reminder that salt cannot fully be lost in that way. It's a sense of time that is ongoing. Reminding us there are ups and downs, but there is an unchangingness to God. It's a sense of stability. That salt shaker on your table will remind you, in the midst of deep change and unrest, that there is something permanent for you. Now, salt offerings are everlasting. They're more, though, than offerings of time and talents and tithe. We ourselves, you are that salt offering. The Gospel of Matthew will say that we are the salt of the earth. We are an offering to God. We offer ourselves. We are God's children in this eternal covenant with our Lord, a salt covenant. God is making a promise to be forever with us, again and again. Again, during this time of shifting sands, let us be reminded of the covenant of salt. A covenant that is not broken. A covenant that God says, "I will face anything with you. I will be there with you, no matter what you're going through." It's a covenant of hope, a covenant of promise, a covenant of peace and stability. Now, Mark promised us, in the words of Jesus, that salt is good. He tells us that today. But he does make a reference to our salt, saying, "But if it loses its saltiness, how can you make it salty again?" In Matthew, it's going to go even a little farther, with Jesus saying, "It is no longer good for anything, our salt, except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot." But wait, Pastor Shannon, you just said salt can be found again, that it's eternal. So what is Jesus really saying? Well, Jesus isn't talking about the permanency of our connection. He's talking about salt becoming contaminated. And I use that word intentionally. In fact, the government of Turkey for a long time had a monopoly on salt. And if others had salt, they would intentionally send soldiers to corrupt and make unfit their salt so that they would have the salt in the kingdom. Now, that notion of corrupting salt, what can do that for us? What can manipulate our salt? What can disrupt the covenant we have with God? Not on God's end, but on our end. And I think it happens when we walk away from God. I think it happens when we start to fall back from God. We become contaminated by outside forces. We begin to lose the pure, unrefined sense of our soul. We forget what we're called to do. The world is so fascinating, isn't it? It's so amazing, but there are so many temptations that can begin to disrupt our end of that commitment. It can disrupt our compound. When we forget that God is with us in everything. When we forget God and only give God a day or an hour or a morning or a night, not realizing that God gave us all of it. When we lose sight of our commitment to God. When we lose our willingness to follow God's will, when we forget our dependence on God, when we shy away from walking with God's people no matter what they face and no matter who we face, when we abuse our connection to God's people, when we hurt intentionally God's people or unintentionally God's people and don't seek forgiveness, but instead just say, this relationship's done. These are ways we contaminate our salt. Christ is calling us back in this passage in Mark to be salt. Salt makes things better. It makes things taste better. It's a seasoner. We cannot make the world better, though, if we forget who makes us better. If we forget who this all begins with. If we lose our sense of God, we lose our sense of selves, and we lose our use to the world. If we find our very own identity in conflict, because we've lost sight of our identity in God, we lose our salt. Maintaining our call and our commitment to God maintains the covenant. It allows us to be preservers, as salt is. Maintaining something beyond what was assumed to be its possible date. Think of salted cod. Now, when we live out the good news, we are a preserver. When we speak out in behalf of others who have no voice, we are a preserver. When we act in love and grace and mercy and forgiveness, when we act in penitence, when we act in humility, we are preservers. We have an opportunity to send salt into the world that has lost its saltiness. We have a way to inscribe it on the hearts of God's people. It's said, actually, in fact, that salt melts ice. Well, I've seen it happen, and some of you have as well, right? What if we were to melt the ice that we find in so many people's hearts, and maybe in our own as well? We can go through and have that connection with God that allows us to laugh at things, to have hope in things, to have trust in things. It melts the ice because we know what really matters. Just a sprinkling of our understanding of God can do that. By bringing God into the world, a God who's already present but not always seen, we have that ability. God is also plentiful and abundant like he is at the Dead Sea, but our natural inclination to reduce our sodium makes it so that we tend to ration God too. Now there's ways to limit God's influence on our life, and we found those ways, but what if we did the exact opposite? What if we loosened our rationing of God's love? We can't say God's only allowed in this much of me, but what if we instead changed our functioning and said, we allow God to take over this much of me? And notice you can't see my hands, I hope. That's the idea. What if it was more than we even imagined? What if our whole being was an offering? Not just our bodies or our work, but our minds and our actions and our hopes and our fears and our dreams and our joy and our pain and our sorrow and our grief. In this time of 2020, could we give all that we are to God? Could we be okay with being honest with God? Even if we sometimes aren't honest with ourselves? Jesus looked at the world when he came into it, and it saddened him because Jesus saw that God was being rationed even then. That we'd left the building in some ways. We'd fallen out of our knowledge of God. We'd forgotten our covenant of salt, our commitment. The saltiness that was needed, Jesus saw was gone. We'd corrupted it, destroyed it from our end. This allows us to see greed and selfishness and act in hatred and warfare and violence and mistrust and doubt and judgment. And we began to put us into others instead of seeing God in others. Jesus' death gave us a new opening, though, to this covenant, a renewed connection. Our salt had a chance to be restored, like the babies that are washed in salt. Our souls washed in the baptism waters were able to be cleansed. Jesus was our purifying agent when we could no longer be it for ourselves. Jesus purified us to a level we never would be able to, took the dirt from our very souls and said that no longer will there be dirt on your souls that breaks this commitment. You can corrupt your salt, but God will always be connected to you. So are we shaken? Are we on the shelf? Or are we being used into the world? Friends, we have the opportunity to literally shake up this world, even now in challenging times. We can sprinkle hope into our relationships, into our lives, into the lives of others. We can revive ourselves so that we can revive the world. We can purify, heal, and cleanse. We can do self-work so that we can do God's work. We can do this if we connect again to that covenant of salt, to find its forever nature, a belief that will help heal our world. Now, the same text, though, I want you to know that talked about our departure from the covenant of salt. When Jesus says this notion in Mark about the saltiness beginning to get corrupted in this way, it also tells us how we can get back in right with our relationships. For Mark 9:50 says, salt is good, but if it lost its saltiness, how can you make it salty again? With a question mark. Have salt amongst yourselves and be at peace with each other. Jesus actually answers for us that question mark. We need to have salt amongst ourselves. Now, this is actually a reference to a Middle Eastern tradition, a tradition of hospitality and respect. To say there is salt between us means we are now friends. If there is no salt between us, it means that there is this notion of distrust, a barrenness, a loss. If you sat down at a table with your enemy and there was no salt between you, it meant that you didn't trust them and you weren't ready to be friends. But if there was salt right in the middle of your table, in between, which we still often do, we're not even knowing why we do it. When you put that salt in the middle, it says that you are going to try to be at peace, that you will put a truce down with that person, that you are starting that relationship again from where you are today. Sometimes the parties would actually lick the salt to seal the deal. It was a seal of bond and friendship and future trust. In some parts of the world, in some parts of our world, the breaking of this trust, once reestablished, would be a pretty big deal. Sometimes it was punishable by death. That's how seriously they took the salt between us. You took it as a way of saying that you truly were preserving your relationship. You were taking a step back into that commitment. I think it's interesting. It's almost like a smaller reflection on this covenant that God has with us as the covenant of salt. Now, God wants us to get along and to try to have salt amongst ourselves. It doesn't mean that we love everything that the other person's doing or that we agree with everything they have done, but it's saying that from this point on, we're going to try to do a strengthening of our relationship, no matter what that looks like. It means that the conversation's not over. Now, I love the image of thinking of the Last Supper because I imagine that Jesus probably has salt right between him and Judas. Don't you think that? that he had salt between him and the man who would betray him, or salt there on that table with Peter who would deny him. This notion of hospitality was known for them. Now we've forgotten it. What if we reclaimed that? Many critique Jesus for eating with sinners, but Jesus turns the question back on them and says, who do you welcome at your table? Is our table welcome for people? Is there salt on it? Now, I think this question is more important than ever in our time, because I think something about 2020 has kind of upset our salt a little bit, hasn't it? It's easy for us to forget covenants of salt. It's easy for us to kind of lose sight of forgiveness and connection and conversation and remembering. And that's what we have to be careful of. Friends, I continually want to remind us of this covenant of salt that is durable and everlasting, that it's purifying and healing. It's good for us to think about salt that way. It's good for us because it reminds us that we need salt to live. We need these healthy connections. We need to give our salt away. It's about relationships. I guess the truth is right now, I think people are tired. Do any of you feel tired? I think people are tending to start nitpicking on each other. I see it in others. I see it in people in the world, in our communities, in the church, in my families, in your families. I see it in myself. I think we have this reality right now where the sense of 2020 is creating this notion of like COVID fatigue, isn't it? This notion of a pandemic withdrawal from us, from our relationships. It's hard to maintain a healthy, normal relationship right now. We're struggling to do that. People are worn out by life. People are feeling worn down by the realities they face. People are having fear for their loved ones. People are feeling pressured. People are worried about the upcoming election. People are politically divided in their own homes, among their friends. There's tension. You can sense it. People are pushing for others to open. People are pushing for others to close. People are feeling emotions rising in areas of ongoing racism, sexism, LGBTQI oppression. Other things are coming into it more and more. Church, community, job, family, emotionships are rising and rising and rising. And it's probably affecting some relationships. It's probably making us take the salt off our table. And right now, more than ever, we need it there. We need it there to remind us of the continuity of life, the stability of life. Of course, we all have our limits. Of course, we can't know the future. We can't control it. And that is unnerving. As the sands are shifting, though, there is this continuity for us, God's eternal covenant with us. God saying, no matter what you face, I am facing it with you. We, by putting that salt on our table, might be able to allow a little more breath into our relationships, a little more room into our relationships, a little more flavor into our relationships. By thinking about the covenant of salt, it allows us to say that there's time to get through all this. As we have before, we will again. So hold on, it will get better. The salt can become a symbol for that. I started by talking about how I'm reminded by Thanksgiving. And I want to come back to that image because Thanksgiving does remind me of salt. Sometimes people will change at the table at Thanksgiving. Sometimes people have passed on. They're no longer sitting with us other than in spirit. But sometimes people are born and come to those tables. Sometimes people are mad for a year, but they'll be back 2 years later. Sometimes you can see some of that unrest across the table one year, but it's fixed the next. Sometimes somebody brings a boyfriend to a table and a couple years down, he's their husband. Or sometimes somebody brings a boyfriend and a couple of years down, there's somebody else there as their husband. A sense of continuity and change, but as a natural rhythm, a natural spoken breath of life, of God. Now more than ever, if we remember our relationship to the covenant of salt and strive to have salt between us, we too can live into what Colossians says about salt. Colossians 4:6 says, "Let your conversation be always full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone." Full of grace, seasoned with salt. That's how we become salt of the earth. By making sure that salt is on our table, in this time more, now than ever. Friends, you truly are the salt of the earth. And when you feel tired, you say that to yourself. I am the salt of the earth. And think what that truly means for you and for the world. Amen.